Okay, chapter 17, Industrial Supremacy. In this chapter, we're going to start looking at a time period known as the Gilded Age. Particularly, we are going to look at what is known as the Second Industrial Revolution. From the end of the Civil War until the dawn of the 20th century, the 1900s, America is going to undergo a huge transformation from an agricultural country to an industrialized one. This is essentially the birth of modern American society. So, we're going to look at the effects of America's Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk about changing business models. And lastly, we're going to begin to examine the question of labor, which obviously is going to have huge repercussions throughout the 1900s. So, effects of the revolution, changing business models, and the question of labor. All right, so let's talk about the Second Industrial Revolution. And it's known as the Second Industrial Revolution because the First Industrial Revolution goes all the way back to the 1700s in Great Britain. Great Britain was the first nation to industrialize, that is, to begin to build factories, to produce manufactured goods, and eventually it will spread from Great Britain then to the rest of Europe, and eventually it will reach the United States. Our Industrial Revolution really begins before the Civil War, but it doesn't really begin to take off until the Civil War, and especially the period of time between the end of the Civil War and the 1900s. So, as I mentioned, the United States undergoes explosive growth between the end of the Civil War and the 20th century. The Civil War really serves as a bridge to an age of economic revolution. And usually we list the starting date as 1876 for a number of reasons. Number one, 1876 is the first centennial. America has been around for 100 years at that point, so it serves as a good benchmark. It's also noted as the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction formally ends 76, 77, somewhere in that time range. So we're exiting Reconstruction, moving into the Industrial Revolution. But probably, most importantly, from 1876 onward is what's known as the Great Transformation. And what I mean by that is this. Going all the way back to the colonial era, beginning in 1607, the population in the United States was agrarian, rural, and isolationistic. And what I mean by that is agrarian. The economy was based largely on crops and livestock. Rural. Most people lived in the country. So that affects, yes, your home, where you physically live, but it also affects your culture. It affects the food that you eat. It affects how you dress. It affects how you keep time. It affects the values that you have. And we were isolationistic. We are concentrated on ourselves. We're focused on our own internal politics, our own social order, our efforts at nation building instead of interacting with the international community. After 1876, as we begin to progress towards modern day society, we are industrial, urban, and international. Industrial. The economy is based on industry, that is, producing manufactured goods. The population is urban. Most people live in cities, and again, that affects your culture, not just your address, but affects how you live, how you eat, where you work, how you spend your money. And we are international. We begin to look outside our borders to see how the United States is going to interact with the rest of the world. Now, don't get me wrong, okay? Neither of these two periods is absolute, okay? These two societies exist side by side for all of American history, including today. The question is, which one of these two groups is dominant? And there's different ways that we can measure this. For example, population, where people live. Pre-Civil War, only 20% of Americans lived in an urban setting. By the time we get to 1900, 40% of Americans live in a city. By 1920, for the first time, people that live in a city outnumber people that live in the country. Okay. Previously, the belief in the United States was, in order to be truly free, you had to own your own land. So from the period of colonization up through the Civil War, the idea was that in order to have true liberty, you must own your own land. Land equal liberty. And the reason for that is, well, number one, in order to engage in the political process. If you wanted to run for political office, if you even wanted to vote, you had to own land. So if you wanted to be engaged in politics, part of that was owning your own land. But more than that, the idea of working for a wage, working for a boss, that was sacrificing too much freedom. In order to be your own boss, in order to truly control your own destiny, you had to own your own land. Otherwise, some other person told you when you had to come to work, when you could leave work, when you could eat your lunch, how you had to dress when you're at work. You know, a boss has really a lot of control over your life. And so the idea was people that worked for a boss weren't truly free. Now, that changes. By the dawn of the 20th century, 2/3 of Americans worked for a wage. So we have migrated past this idea that in order to be free, you had to own your own land. Now, most people are at least okay with working for somebody else. Working for a wage, such as in a factory, has become much more acceptable. And this movement from farm to town really leads to the creation of a new class in America, the working class. And again, the people of the working class mainly live in the cities because that's where all the factories are, right? And as we move into the 1800s, we follow a pretty standard path into a modern society that other societies all over. It's the same blueprint all over the world. We see dramatic technological advances, especially in communication and transportation and production. We see the creation of a nation state that is a definable identity and ideology. Who are Americans? What does it mean to be an American? We have to go through the very bloody Civil War to figure that out. But after the war, we know the Civil War, maybe more than anything else, was an act of nation building. It was an act of defining who we are, what does it mean to be an American, and in fact, who can be an American. And the key to the movement towards present-day society is going to be the act of industrialization itself. Now, here's the thing. The United States was not the first country to industrialize. I've already mentioned that. It actually begins 200 years prior, at least 100 years prior, in Great Britain. What's remarkable about the United States is not the fact that we were first, because we weren't. It's the fact, it's how quickly we catch up to everyone else. We really get started before the Civil War, but it's only after the Civil War that it really explodes. So we are talking about in less than a generation, we go from no industry to leading the world in industry. By 1913, the United States is responsible for 1/3 of the world's industrial output. Think about that for a second. Between the end of the Civil War, we are an agrarian, rural society whose economy is focused on growing crops and raising livestock. Less than a generation away from that, 1 out of every 3 manufactured goods produced in the world is produced in the United States. That's amazing. So the question is, why does it occur so quickly? Well, there are several factors that contribute to industrial growth in the United States. First and foremost is the Civil War itself. And yes, during wartime, that does slow down progress in some areas. Towns are damaged or destroyed. What factories there were are damaged, are destroyed. We lose workforce, labor force, and when people die in the war. Okay, fine. It does slow down progress in some areas, but it increases in others. For example, we are forced to produce our own goods. During the war, we need clothing for uniforms. We need guns to fight the war. We need food to feed the troops. And so for the first time, we really have to rely on ourselves to produce these materials. And so that's a giant kickstart to industrialization in the United States. Secondly, natural resources. We are blessed to have everything that we need. We had land for expansion and to grow food. We had readily abundant and accessible supplies of iron ore and coal, steel, and oil. We have supplies of precious and industrial metals. So we have all the natural resources we need to industrialize a society. We have the population. And this is important for two reasons, actually. I've already mentioned you need a labor supply. If you're going to build all these factories, you need to have available workers to come in and work in them. So yes, we have a large enough population that we can supply a labor supply. The other thing is you also need a market. If you're producing all these goods, someone's going to have to buy them. So we do have a large enough population to have the labor force and the market as well. I'm going to throw some more numbers at you. In 1860, the population of the United States is 31.5 million people. That's pre-Civil War. After the Civil War, including all the death and destruction that occurred, pre-Civil War, 31.5 million. By 1900, we've reached 75 million. That is a huge increase. And it's not all natural increases, right? A huge chunk of that is coming from population, people moving into the United States from outside sources. And then lastly, the federal government. The federal government took a very active role in industrializing the United States, whether that was passing high tariffs to protect American industry, whether that was land grants to get factories off the ground, whether that was fighting wars out west against the Native Americans, like we spoke about in the last chapter. The United States government took a very, very active role in ensuring industrialization for the United States. Now, the beginnings of the American Industrial Revolution is really centered around the Great Lakes region, places like Pittsburgh and Chicago, for a number of reasons. Number one, the Great Lakes themselves provided easy transportation and also plentiful natural resources. Pittsburgh has access to iron and steel. Ohio has large concentrations of iron ore. Pennsylvania also has coal and oil. And so these regions are going to grow into the very first industrial centers of the United States. I mean, there's a reason the Pittsburgh, professional football team is known as the Steelers, because for decades it was a steel town. So it's really going to start in the Great Lakes region and then sort of radiate out from there. But even today, that area of the United States is known as the Rust Belt, right? Because that is where the majority of our manufacturing, which we've kind of moved past, was once located. Now, the driving force behind the Second Industrial Revolution is going to be steel, especially as we develop new techniques for creating more plentiful, cheaper, stronger steel, things like the Bessemer process and the open hearth process. You don't have to remember the technological details. Just know that as we learn to produce steel more quickly, more cheaply, and more stronger steel, that is going to be a huge driving push to the Industrial Revolution. And in many ways, it's going to both cause and require railroads to expand. New steel production is closely tied to the growth in railroads because on the one hand, it makes it easier to expand the railroad because if you have cheap, plentiful, strong steel, it's easier to get your hands on it, so you have a bigger supply in order to build your railroads. That's fine. It makes the actual construction of railroad lines easier. Plus, as railroad lines expand and new towns begin to pop up, the expansion of railroads are going to create new markets that require new goods and provide more raw materials, which can in turn be fed back into the market. We also see the growth of the petroleum industry. Not so much gasoline at the beginning, but things like oil for lubricants that the railroads required. Other technological innovations and advances during this time, we see the birth of gasoline-powered engines. We see the development of the railroad. We see the development of the airplane. I'm sorry, my mind went blank. We see the development of the airplane. Orville and Wilbur Wright in North Carolina, 1903, the first powered flight in history. We see advances in communication technology. This is a diagram of the transatlantic cable. Essentially, what they did, they strung a huge telegraph line between the United States and Great Britain. So for the first time, you could know what was going on in Great Britain, not simultaneously. I think I read once that it took several minutes for the signal to actually travel down all these miles of telegraph wire, but still, rather than waiting days to find out what was happening in the rest of the world, now you could know in a matter of minutes or hours things that were happening thousands of miles away. It was really quite amazing. Other inventions include the telephone, the typewriter, handheld cameras. So we're seeing huge jumps forward in terms of technology. And if you had to put a face to this, age of innovation, it would be this guy right here, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was born in 1847, later known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. He's generally regarded as the father of the modern industrial research lab. This idea of getting a bunch of scientists together, put them in a room, and see what they can come up with. He formalizes the process of research and development. It's not just individual inventors thinking to themselves, hey, that would be a neat idea. I wonder if I can make that. No, he goes to the step of actually recruiting people, putting everybody in a big giant room together and saying, okay, let's see what we can come up with. He is credited with the invention of the phonograph, of a practical light bulb, of motion pictures. He was instrumental in creating the first distribution grid of electricity. So he is truly probably the face of innovation during the late 1800s into the 1900s. Okay, let's talk about competition and consolidation for a few minutes, because we're going to see that the way American companies do business is going to change drastically as we move into the 1900s. And one giant change is going to be the idea of scientific management. As companies began to grow and as people began to look for ways to make production more efficient, they're going to apply the principles of scientific management to production. This is known as Taylorism. It's known as Taylorism after its, I guess you could say the man who invented it. His name was Frederick Taylor. Taylorism is the principle, the idea of reorganizing production by subdividing tasks, which would speed up production, make workers interchangeable, and reduce the need for skilled employees. I'm going to say that again. Taylorism. Reorganize production by subdividing tasks, which would speed up production, make workers interchangeable, and reduce the need for skilled employees. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you are a shoemaker, and your job is to make shoes. You are a master shoemaker. You have studied for years under the best shoemakers available, and you can do every part of the shoemaking process. You create the laces, you create the upper parts, you create the soles, you create the tongues, and you know how to stitch it all together to create the best possible shoe imaginable. Now, how many pairs of shoes do you think you can produce a day, overseeing each and every aspect of shoe creation? Probably not all that many. And how long is it going to take you to get to the point where you are a master shoemaker? It's going to take you years to get to that point. Well, the idea behind Taylorism says, okay, well, what if we did it this way? What if we put everybody in a big room and we taught some people only how to make the laces, and we taught some people only how to make the tongues, and we taught some people only how to make the soles, and we taught some people only how to put them together? If you reduce the tasks, if you subdivide the tasks, People will become more efficient at their task. It will speed up production. It will make workers interchangeable. No longer are you a master shoemaker. You only have to know how to make the laces. And you can probably be taught how to run the lace making machine in a couple of hours. So if somebody is sick and doesn't show up to work that day, the whole factory doesn't shut down. You can pull somebody in off the street, say, here's the machine that we use to make the shoelaces. This is how you run it. And in a couple of hours, they're up to speed. So it reduces the need for skilled employees. You no longer need master shoemakers. You need somebody that you can teach to run the machine, which you can probably do in a couple of hours. For the first time, you're really beginning to divide. You're really creating two separate pools. You're saying these are the people that are going to plan the work, and these are going to be the people that execute the work. They're no longer the same person. You're really beginning to transfer control of the workplace from the workers over to management. And that's going to be very important in a few minutes. We're going to talk about that more in just a few minutes. Also important is the creation of the moving assembly line. I mentioned the birth of gasoline-powered technology in the last slide. Henry Ford creates his first car in 1906. And Henry Ford, probably more than the creation of, the Model T, he is credited his greatest invention was the moving assembly line. Okay, I take that back. Maybe he didn't develop this moving assembly line, but he was the first person to use it to the best effect. And again, just some numbers here. Using a moving assembly line, Henry Ford is able to cut production to 1/10 of the time and 1/3 of the cost. That's why everybody drove Fords, because it was quicker and cheaper to produce them than any other car on the market. So we are going to see lots and lots of new growth. Companies are becoming more efficient. They're learning how to produce more product. They're learning how to produce products more cheaply. People are going to buy these products. We are going to see huge new growth. But it's also very volatile growth. Very high highs, but also very low lows. From 1873 to 1897, the country is going to undergo what's known as the Great Depression. Now, this is not the Great Depression of the 1930s, but it was the worst one in the country's history up to that point. So to them, the people who were living in it, it was their Great Depression. And we're going to see some changes come about because of this. People begin to realize that these companies are just too big for one man to handle. So we're going to see the birth of modern corporations. We're going to see changes in the way that businesses are run. For example, modern corporations are going to begin to sell stock. I know that you're all familiar with the stock market, but if you don't know what stock is, when you buy stock, you're literally buying a small slice of that company. So if you own a company and you decide to sell stock and you sell 100 shares of stock, you've essentially divided your company up into 100 little pieces and sell them to other people. And there's a couple of good reasons to do that. Number one, it raises money for your company. Number two, it's the idea behind limited liability. Limited liability. And let me give you an example. If you own your own company and it's only you that owns it and you own that company as part of your property, let's say that you own a dog food company. I don't know. You own a dog food company and you begin to produce dog food. And it turns out your dog food is not very good and it begins making dogs sick. So people begin to sue you. Well, if your company goes bankrupt, that's one thing. But if you own your company as a sole proprietor, if you're the only one, it may not stop at your company. So what I mean by that is, let's say that your company's worth $1 million and people sue you for $10 million. Well, they're going to get everything they can out of your company, and then they're coming after you. They're going to take your home. They're going to take the money in your bank account. They're going to take all your assets because there's no distinction between you and your company. Now, the idea behind limited liability is if you own stock in that company, you don't get all the reward, but you have much less risk. So say, for example, if you own stock in Walmart and Walmart goes bankrupt, Can somebody come after your bank account and your home and your assets if you own stock in Walmart and it goes bankrupt? No, because your liability is limited. Now, yes, you're going to lose the value of that stock, but your risk is limited. That's the appeal of limited liability. That's the appeal of owning stock. You get reward, but not a lot of the risks. We begin to see new ways of controlling employees. We begin to see middle management. This is really the time that middle management comes into fruition. You don't just have the factory owner and the factory workers anymore. Now you have all these levels in these huge companies. So you have accountants, you have mid-level managers, you have shift bosses, you have floor bosses. You have all these different people in this hierarchy of control, and things become much more complex. We see competition becomes ruthless, and it leads to some shady practices. For example, fixed prices. Part of the appeal of capitalism is the idea that competition will drive prices down. Let me give you another example. Let's say that you have two gas stations, one on each side of the street. And one day, gas station A puts its gas at $2 a gallon, and gas station B puts its gas at $1.90 a gallon. Well, who are people going to buy their gas from? They're going to buy their gas from the one with the cheaper prices, right? So what is gas station A going to have to do? They're going to have to drop their price from $2 to at least $1.90, and if they want their customers back, they're going to have to go even lower than that, right? So maybe they go to $1.85. The second gas station sees that, maybe they cut their prices down to $1.85. So that's kind of the idea behind competition in capitalism, is the idea that competition will drive efficiency. It will drive prices lower. Well, that's the theory. What happens, though, if the owners of gas station A and gas station B meet together in a cigar smoke filled back room, and they say, look, we are the only competition. What if we both set our prices at $2.50 a gallon? If you promise not to lower yours, I promise not to lower mine. That's what's known as price fixing. You have no competition, and you have no choice as a consumer but to buy the gas for $2.50 a gallon. And that's not right. That is illegal. But we began to see that in the United States during this time. We see the growth of trusts. Trusts are gatherings of companies. So, for example, you have all these different oil companies. Rather than owning stock in each of those individual oil companies, the trust buys all the oil companies, and you own stock in the trust. You don't control the oil companies, you just get profit. That leads to a monopoly, right? If you have no competition, if you own everything, you can set your price, and there's nothing that anyone can do about it. Monopolies are illegal. And so what we're seeing here, we're seeing all these mergers that are creating huge companies. Companies like U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. U.S. Steel, well, I'm going to the next slide, Andrew Carnegie, okay? Andrew Carnegie is he really is a rags to riches success story. He's a Scottish immigrant that moves to the United States with barely the clothes on his back. You have John D. Rockefeller, who's the owner of Standard Oil, which at one time controls greater than 95% of the oil market in the United States. These men are millionaires many times over. And that's part of the problem. We're seeing the creation of these huge companies that have virtually no competition, and we're seeing a very uneven distribution of wealth. Now, most everybody's life is getting better. I will say that. The standard of living for pretty much everyone in the United States is going up. The issue is that some people's standards of living is going up at almost a vertical rate compared to everyone else. So everybody's doing at least a little bit better, but some people are doing a lot better. And even today, their names are synonymous with wealth, right? Carnegie, Rockefeller, these names still mean money even today. And we're going to talk about that more in just a little bit, because depending upon your point of view, men like this are either, they're captains of industry that build, these are the men that built the United States into what it is today, or they're these robber barons that exploited their workers and took advantage of them everywhere they could and destroyed competition so they could set the price at whatever they felt like it, who got rich off the backs of others. And we're going to talk about that more in just a few minutes. Let's talk about politics, because that's going to lead into it. Politics in the Gilded Age. I didn't mention this before, but Gilded Age is not necessarily a nice term. It's a pejorative. It's a derogatory term. If something is gilded, that means it's a falseness, right? For example, if you have a gilded candlestick, it's a substandard material like wood, but the outside of it is covered to make it look like something else. So you might have a wooden candlestick, that's gold plated, and so it looks pretty. It looks like it's solid gold, but once you begin to chip away at the outside, you begin to realize it's not pretty all the way down. And that's really what this means, the Gilded Age. It was a term that was actually coined by Mark Twain, the American, novelist and poet. And really what he was saying was, if you were looking at the United States from the outside, everything looks great. Our industry is booming. Our economy is booming. People are getting filthy, stinking rich. We're developing all these amazing technological innovations. Everything looks great from the outside. But if you begin to chip away just a little bit, you begin to see that the core is rotten. And that's what they're talking about. 1868, we see the election of Ulysses S Grant as President of the United States. And this is remarkable. Ulysses S Grant, nothing against the man himself. Obviously, his main claim to fame, he was the successful general of the Northern forces during the Civil War. He's a war hero. He's a brilliant general. But he is not a politician. In fact, if my memory serves correctly, the presidency of the United States was the first elected office he had ever held. Think about that for a second. The first elected office that he had ever held was the presidency of the United States. So he's not a politician. He's a soldier. He is not a politician. So when he becomes and as a matter of fact, I also want to point out he's not really a Republican. I think he could have just as easily ran as a Democrat. But anyway, he's not really a politician. So what he does once he becomes the president, in a landslide, by the way, it was not even close. Once he becomes president, he surrounds himself with all of his friends and advisors that he expects to help him lead the country. But as it turns out, maybe his judgment wasn't so sound either, because a lot of his advisors and friends are incredibly corrupt. And so we're going to see that Grant's presidency is going to be marred by scandal after scandal after scandal, not necessarily because he himself is a bad guy. And from all indications, he wasn't. He wasn't corrupt. He was an upstanding individual, but he was in over his head. And he surrounded himself with people he expected to help him, and as it turns out, maybe not so much. Now, a lot of Americans see their country, America, in theory, in our minds, is great. We are this beacon. We are this bastion of democracy. We have the best government in the world. Now, in reality, maybe sometimes it always doesn't live up to that. But at least in our minds, we are this beacon of democracy. We are this example that the rest of the world should want to follow. But as we move into the late 1800s, people are beginning to question this. And they're beginning to question this because of big business. And they're beginning to wonder, are these huge corporations beginning to threaten our freedom? Are they beginning to threaten our liberty? Political machines like the Tweed Ring are using corruption and bribery to essentially steal elections. They're getting people elected through corrupt practices. All the scandals that I mentioned that are going to go on during the Grant presidency. Nothing is getting done. America is very closely divided on party lines. the North and Midwest belong to the Republican Party. The South is still solidly Democratic. And so what we see is things seesaw from one side to the other. We'll have Republicans in charge one year, and then the next year the Democrats will be in charge, and then the Democrats will lose control back over to the Republicans. And so we have many one-term presidents. Now, I will say this. Since the end of the Civil War up through the 1930s and the Great Depression, the Republican Party far and away dominated the presidency. There are far more Republican presidents than there are Democratic presidents between the end of the Civil War and the 1930s. But below that, at all the other levels of government, it seesaws between the political parties. And what that leads to is paralyzed legislation. The Democrats and the Republicans can't get along with one another. Neither side can get a majority to enforce their agenda on the other. And so it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Nothing is getting done. Does that sound familiar to anyone? And so what happens is the federal government is paralyzed. And it should be noted, the federal government was ill-equipped to deal with this new economy. At this point in American history, the federal government is still relatively small. Now, it's a lot larger than it had been before the Civil War. The Civil War represents a huge growth in the size and power of the federal government, as you would expect. But even after the Civil War, it's still relatively small and ill-equipped to deal with all of this change. And so what we see is that the states are more or less going to be on their own. And, they're not getting a lot of guidance and they're not getting a lot of direction from the federal government. And so people are beginning to ask themselves, is this still the land of opportunity? A lot of people are looking at the system and they're looking at the influence that big business is buying. They're looking at all the corruption. They're looking at the scandals and they're wondering, is America headed in the right direction? And some people feel that the United States is going down the wrong path. Distrust is beginning to grow between employers and employees. Like I said, some people are getting really, really, really rich. Some people are getting a little bit less poor. There's lots of distrust on both sides. Wage labor is no longer a temporary status. America is now firmly divided between the haves and the have-nots. And this is something that's relatively new for the United States. And now, don't get me wrong, there have always been people who are more successful than others in the United States. But one of the things that the United States used to pride itself on was its equality. That there wasn't these huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots. That even the lowest rungs of society still could participate in society. They still had the opportunity to better themselves. They could still, last chapter we spoke about the West as an opportunity. There was still this opportunity to go out West and start over in a clean slate and make something out of yourself and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And now our people are beginning to wonder, well, how am I expected to compete with the U.S. steels? How am I expected to compete with the Standard Oil? How can a man on his own succeed against these giant corporations? And so we see two schools of thought begin to develop out of this. People arrive at really two different answers. And the first school of thought has to do with social Darwinism. Charles Darwin, as you probably know, was an English biologist, right? He's most famous for his theory of evolution. And essentially, if you have to boil, the theory of evolution down to a single sentence, I think it would best be survival of the fittest. And we've all heard that before, right? Survival of the fittest. Those that are best suited to survive will. The fastest, the strongest, those with the strongest teeth and the sharpest claws in the natural world, we're talking about animals here, they will survive and pass those traits on to their offspring. That is, that's Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in a nutshell. Well, people begin to apply things that were previously, applied to animals. They begin to apply that to human behavior. People are asking themselves, why are some people, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers of the world, why are they so Well, it's social Darwinism. The Carnegies and the Rockefellers are successful because they're the best, because they win at life. And so who do you think is going to subscribe to this theory? Do you think it's going to be the factory owners or the factory workers? Well, it's going to be the factory owners, right? Why am I so rich and everyone else isn't? Well, it's because I'm the best suited. I'm the fittest. I win at life. That's social Darwinism. It's this idea that natural selection and evolution, those are natural processes, and government should not interfere with those. That is the explanation for the success and failure of different people. It is a natural process that the government should leave alone. It's this idea, liberty of contract. Liberty of contract refers to this idea that government should be limited. And what I mean by that, people should be free to acquire and dispose of property without interference. You should be able to earn your money and spend your money how you want to without the government interfering. As long as the contract is freely arrived at by both parties, as long as the factory owners and the factory workers both agree to the contract, the government should not interfere. An unrestrained free market. So, for example, a person who is in favor of liberty of contract would be against the idea of minimum wage. If someone is willing to work for $6 an hour, why should I be required to pay them $7 an hour? The idea of a minimum work week, or a maximum work week. If someone is willing to work $60 an hour, if they want to go out and apply themselves and work hard, if they want to work for $60 an hour, 60 hours a week, why should I tell them that they're only allowed to work 40 hours a week? So as you can see, this is probably going to fall more on the side of factory owners rather than factory workers, right? Because in that equation, the factory owners are probably going to have a lot more power, right? So this idea that the contract is freely arrived at, well, I don't know that you can ever escape, some form of coercion. So that's one side. The other side is what's known as the gospel of wealth. And actually, Andrew Carnegie is responsible for this. Gospel of Wealth was a book that he wrote. And it's kind of the idea, with great power comes great responsibility. And Andrew Carnegie saw himself as someone who had responsibility to the rest of society. That he had millions of dollars. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world. But with that money, he should do good with it. So, for example, when he died, he gave away the vast bulk of his fortune to the Carnegie Foundation, which helps fund education and the arts throughout the United States even today. We begin to see books being written about this gulf between the haves and the have-nots. Progress and Poverty by Henry George and Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. Looking Backward in particular, it was kind of this sci-fi time travel book in which somebody travels to the future and they see what America becomes. And it's this very socialistic utopian society where there is no private property. There are no haves and have-nots because there is no haves, because nobody owns anything. It's all held in collective property. So anyway, it's really interesting, the two different sides to this. And so the big national question before the Civil War was, what are we going to do about slavery? Now the big national question has become, what are we going to do about labor? Because it has become very, very evident that some people are really, really unhappy with the status quo. They're really unhappy with this shift to a model where some people get really, really rich and some people get a little bit less rich, a little bit less poor, excuse me. But there's always the question of power, right? How can one man or woman, how can one worker stand up against the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Vanderbilts of the United States? How are they going to stand up against these millionaires? What good does one man walking out of a factory saying, I won't participate in the system anymore, what good is that going to do? Well, nothing, because they'll just hire somebody else off the street and put them to work. But what if everybody walked out of the factory? Of course, we're talking about unions. Unions have been around in the United States for a long time, even going back pre-Civil War. But we don't really see any concentrated efforts at creating a national union until really after the Civil War is concluded. The first major union, national union in the United States is the National Labor Union, very inventive name, which begins in 1866, founded by William Sylvis. It doesn't last all that long. It's only around for a couple of years. And as we move through the 1870s, we don't see a whole lot of unions. Probably the most important one is the Knights of Labor, which is founded by Samuel Gompers. Now, a lot of people label Gompers as a communist or a socialist, and that's really not true. Excuse me, I said Gompers. I meant Uriah Stevens. And that's not really true. The Knights of Labor didn't have a lot of success. It wasn't necessarily to the fault of Uriah Stevens. It was open to pretty much all workers, including women, which was really notable for the time. Knights of Labor did allow women, even women who worked from home, were allowed to join. Pretty much the only restrictions as included in the bylaws was no lawyers, no bankers, no liquor dealers, or professional gamblers. So if you fell into one of those categories, you were out of luck. But pretty much anyone else was open to join. And like I said, it didn't have a whole lot of success. One thing that's going to hasten its fall is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The Eastern Railroads announced a 10% pay cut. We see strikes occurring from St. Louis all the way to Baltimore. Strikers destroy equipment. They're going to riot in the streets. State militias are going to be called out. Eventually, President Rutherford B. Hayes is going to order troops to suppress the rioters. Over 100 people die before it's all over. It's a pretty big deal. It's the first major national labor conflict. And it does not end well for the workers. We see the creation of the American Federation of Labor, better known as the AFL, in 1881 from Samuel Gompers. Interestingly enough, Gompers isn't a big fan of government interference. He doesn't want to get involved in politics, but as we'll see, not really able to avoid that. Still talking about labor, we see some pretty big events. The first May Day, May 1st, 1886, workers strike in demand for an 8-hour workday, which of course they eventually get. We see the Haymarket Affair, McCormick Harvester, which was a farming implement. The factory goes on strike. There's hostility between striking workers and city police. 11 people end up dead. Other people are arrested and sentenced to death. People began to associate unions with anarchy, right? And society, and I should mention, popular opinion is almost always against the idea of unions. The average person on the street sees unions as a dangerous thing. They see them as chaotic and anarchic. They see them as communistic, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. We see the Homestead Strike in 1892. Technology is increasing to the point where some workers can be replaced by technology. Workers go on strike. The plants shut down. There's violence between striking union workers and factory guards. People are killed. We see the Pullman strike of 1894. Pullman manufactured railway sleepers for trains. They cut wages by 25%. People go on strike. President Cleveland will eventually order in troops to break the strike. People are arrested. And eventually, this is what it's all building up to. This is really what it's all building up to. Eventually, labor realizes that changing the individual factories is not going to work. People can go on strike, and sometimes they won. I don't mean to say that it was entirely a one-sided affair. sometimes the strikers got what they wanted. And of course, living in today's America, we know we have 8-hour workdays. We know that we have 40-hour work weeks. So yes, the things they were fighting for, they do eventually get. But they don't get them necessarily because they go on strike, okay? These little pockets of resistance weren't working. They began to realize if they wanted to create permanent change, they're not going to change each individual business. They're going to have to change the laws that govern business, right? So they begin to realize if they want to implement permanent change, they're going to have to get involved in politics. And as we move into the 1900s, we will see that labor as a political force is going to be a huge, huge thing. My mind went blank. Labor emerging as a political force will be a huge theme of the 20th century. And we will touch on that more as we move throughout this semester.